All right, Notre Dame fans, special guest today, Chris Zorich, uh, legendary Notre Dame player. Really excited to have him on. We're going to be talking about some of the topics that we discussed last week with former Notre Dame quarterback Rick Mirer. Actually, Chris told me he watched the video and he wanted to be on the show, so we're really excited to have Chris on. So, Chris, first of all, how you doing, man?
Well, thank you very much. I'm a fan. I remember Blue and Gold back from when I was 18 years old, and it used to be a little, I think maybe a 6-page magazine or something like that. It used to come to my house. I think every family got a subscription when they accepted a scholarship to Notre Dame, and then after that, that's how my mom would kind of keep up with all the stuff that's going on at Notre Dame. So I've been a fan for, Jesus, what is that, 30 years or something like that? Wow.
Yeah, Blue and Gold established 1981.
Well, maybe not since 81, but at least since 87.
Yeah, we go a ways back. We're actually coming up on the year of the late great Lou Simoji's passing. Just wish Lou were here with us. I wish Lou were doing this interview with you, Chris, instead of me. But
it's really interesting. On my podcast, and this is, I mean, obviously, Lou's passing was really all of a sudden. And I was actually talking to him and Tim Priester about coming on my podcast. And like literally, because they're both those guys, well, Lou was literally created Blue and Gold, but I remember those guys working for Blue and Gold way back when. So, I wanted to do one with them, but then, unfortunately, he passed away. So.
Yeah, it's still, man, I think about it every day. I mean, our message board at blueandgold.com is literally titled the Loose Emoji board, which, Chris, I got to get you on there, by the way. So, I mean, I think about them daily, and, man, it still feels so weird. I was covering a 7-on-7 tournament that morning, and Lou's not posting updates on the message board from Brian Kelly's press conference that day, and I'm calling him, and, man, it still feels fresh, but this was not on the discussion topics for us, Chris. So
that's fine. I mean, I love the guy, man. I mean, it's interesting because, like, when you talk to him, I mean, like, literally, I was like, yeah, I don't remember that game. He's like, it's blah 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 game. You did this, and I was like, dude, how do you remember? It's not like I'm a quarterback, and you're like, oh yeah, you threw for 100 yards or whatever. I mean, like, literally, he was like, yeah. You had a good game, or defensive line didn't do too well that game. I mean, his memory was just amazing.
Yeah. So we'll kind of get into the main topic of discussion here, Chris. Notre Dame. This news broke this past week. Notre Dame scheduling Tennessee State. I guess just your general thoughts. I mean, this is something you definitely wanted to talk about. So, do you like Notre Dame scheduling the HBCU and FCS school?
Well, first of all, the idea of me kind of contacting you guys, I actually watched the interview you guys did with Rick and also Tim, and I thought the discussion was great. But I reached out to you because I just wanted to kind of see if you had a chance to kind of talk to any of the other players outside of Rick. And the reason why I reached out was because, I mean, I spent 2 years working with Jack Swarbrick on our scheduling committee, the football scheduling committee. I was fortunate enough to assist in negotiating some of the contracts. So, like, I know a lot that went, not necessarily with TSU, but in general, what goes on with a schedule. And I thought it was great that you guys put, I think, the next 10 years of scheduling on the screen. And it was so interesting because I kind of laughed when I saw it because, I mean, was it 5 or 6 ACC games a year?
Yep, 5.
Okay, so 5 ACC games. So when Jack and I were doing it, I mean, that was way before the ACC. So, like, literally, we had to schedule 12 games, basically, right? And so obviously you had your Navies that were always there. But it was so interesting because I don't think folks really realize how hard it is to schedule opponents for Notre Dame. I think Jack talked a little bit about it at the press conference with Tennessee State, and he was really kind of talking about how complex it is. And, it's so interesting now. It helps now that there's 5 ACC games, but even the games outside of the ACC games, you got to think about, like, really one of the things that we always wanted was a good opponent, like in November, right? October, right? Because it's getting kind of cold in South Bend, and you don't want NBC kind of flashing the camera, and then all of a sudden, there aren't a lot of folks in the stands, right? That just doesn't look good for the brand. And so being able to get viable opponents that folks want to come to games for was a challenge, in the later months. And I think that's something that a lot of folks don't think about. They think about, oh, well, Notre Dame, they can get anybody. And yeah, you can get a quality, but it's hard to get a quality opponent that you want to do a guarantee game with, that folks would want to come. Now, yeah, we can go reach out to like SEC and the bigger school, USC and the bigger schools to do a home and home, but trying to set up a guarantee game with a good opponent in the later months was always a challenge. So it's very complex, as Jack was talking about, because, it's the idea that you want to play a solid opponent always, but sometimes they just aren't available. So when they talked at the press conference, when they talked about working with Tennessee State, that date was actually open, right? So being able to kind of talk to them to find out, and I don't know this, I didn't do the research, I'm not the athletic director over there, but I'm pretty sure they may even have had an opponent, right? Because it's only 2 years out, right? So, and that was a challenge sometimes for us when there was an opponent that we wanted to play, and they were like, yeah, well, we have a game, but what you can do is you can buy out our game and then schedule us.
The complex nature of this stuff.
Seriously, and it's so funny because it's almost like Jack had to have a crystal ball to find out, like, who was going to be competitive, 5, 10, 15 years out, right? I mean, the idea of, again, knowing who's going to be good in the future, are they good now? And so it's so funny because there was a time when, we didn't have any MAC schools yet. And I want to say, I think it was either Central Michigan or West. I think it was Central Michigan was the first MAC school that Notre Dame played. And that was just a couple of years ago. I mean, I remember being involved in that conversation and saying, hey, is this something we want to do? But for us, we were trying to find a game, and they have it available.
So, Chris, the FCS side of it, being that this will be the first FCS team Notre Dame's ever played, as a former Notre Dame player and someone who obviously helped out Jack Swarbrick with scheduling, how does that sit with you? A lot of Notre Dame fans don't care about it. A lot of Notre Dame fans are upset by it. Do you think that this lessens Notre Dame's strength of schedule? I'm of the opinion that playing Ball State or Tennessee State's not going to make much of a difference at the end of the day. Where do you land on that, Chris?
Well, I feel the exact same way. And it's interesting because the folks that were up in arms about, hey, we've never played a MAC school before, were fine with playing Akron and the Western Michigans. And this is just the same thing. I think what makes it different is because it's an HBCU, and Notre Dame has never played an historically black college, right? And I think that's what's really significant about this. And I mean, they could have scheduled Mercer just like Alabama does, just like Auburn does, but they chose not to. Now, I'm sure there were conversations behind the scenes. It wasn't just Jack. I mean, I'm sure, you're talking about Coach Freeman, you're talking about their athletic director.
Eddie George, the Ohio State connection.
I mean, the idea, and I kind of chuckled when they were saying, oh, well, Ohio State has nothing to do. Of course it does. I mean, that's your boy, I mean, you want to take care of your boy. And the idea of being able to really kind of spread the wealth, so to speak, right? Because when you think about they have no problem giving a guaranteed game to Akron, to Ball State, to whomever.
Hey, Chris, guarantee game. You're talking like a bye game, like where
I'm
they
sorry. Yeah,
pay the opponent.
I
Yeah,
apologize.
Notre Dame had a bye game where they paid Cincinnati, and then Cincinnati came and whooped their butts. So,
Well, I was
quick
going to
note.
talk about that, right? And so that's part of kind of the crystal ball, right? Because I guarantee, now I wasn't there for that game, but I guarantee you that game happened because Brian Kelly was there, right? And so it was like, hey, let's take care of the former school that I was at. And so that game, I'm sure, was scheduled like 3 or 4 years in advance. And then it just so happens for Cincinnati, it was the perfect storm last year, right? Because they beat the crap out of Notre Dame, and they also got a big fat check. And oh, by the way, that was their best win, which obviously gave them the chance to compete in the Final Four.
I think it was like $1 million Cincinnati got for that
No,
game.
exactly. I mean, and that's. I mean, and it's funny because they actually joked at the press conference about how much the guarantee was with Tennessee State. But the idea that Notre Dame is extending themselves to this historically black college is really just huge. And it's funny because I was kind of reading on social media and looking at some of the comments.
Don't ever do that.
Well, it helps, or it gets frustrating when one of your own fellow football alums calls the folks who are excited about it woke idiots. Which and that's what Brady Quinn said. And I understand his frustration, but the idea that we're able to assist just in the same way Mike Brady did on Martin Luther King Day, right? I mean, he played Howard, and it was a great competitive game. And when you think about the historic part of this, right? And even if you want to go back, 70 years, I mean, at one point, folks didn't want to play Notre Dame because we were a small regional school. So if you want to have that conversation about how folks helped us out, and then the whole barnstorming idea of getting on a train and Rockies going all over the country to kind of play folks to get exposure for Notre Dame was important. And so now we're able to kind of assist another school that's in a lower division. I mean, I posted Notre Dame made a video about kind of the game between Notre Dame and Tennessee State. I mean, I posted that on my social media because I thought it was important. I mean, when was the last time, which obviously never happened, that you had Notre Dame in the same conversation, Notre Dame football in the same conversation with a historically black college football team? And that's never happened. I just wish the hate of Eddie Robinson and Grambling, that would have been great to have a traditional school like that involved in this game. But it's extremely important because, and I guarantee you, I was talking to some of my former teammates, and I was kind of telling them that it's really important to be able to find somebody to not necessarily just play the game, but also understand how important it is as a whole. But the important part is that Notre Dame is setting an example, right? And I guarantee you, now that Notre Dame has done it, I guarantee you other schools are going to say, well, hey, it's okay now because Notre Dame done it. And you got to realize how big of a stage we're talking about here, right? We're talking about a Notre Dame home game and the exposure that it's going to bring to Tennessee State.
Chris, I mean, you look at Notre Dame's scheduling, Ireland game, Vegas, Shamrock Series, all this cool. It just seems like Notre Dame likes to have these big spotlight games that, is talked about nationally, cool venues. And Notre Dame scheduling an HBCU opponent is different than that in a scheduling light. I mean, like cool venues like playing in Soldier Field or you're playing in Lambeau. It's different. But it feels just as important to me for Notre Dame playing an HBCU school. Can you talk a little bit more about the importance of that in your eyes? Because, for me, I can talk about the FCS component, but as some random white dude, I don't know as much about the HBCU aspect. So tell me about why you think that's so impactful.
Well, I just think it's important because it's an example. First of all, it's never been done before. And oh, by the way, we have a black coach. I mean, okay, this is the perfect timing, right? We have a black coach. Now we have a chance to really kind of explore the idea of, again, why are there so few black coaches in Division I football, right? And so now, along with that conversation, since we have a black coach now let's also talk about the disparity that you have between historically black colleges and regular institutions, right? I mean, when you think about the idea of really kind of understanding kind of why they were created, right? They were created because you had smart, young black men and women who weren't allowed to go to state schools. I mean, we can talk about Selma. We can talk about, I'm not a history major, but the idea of understanding why these schools were created in the first place was because they couldn't go to white institutions. So now they've created institutions on their own, which is fabulous because they weren't allowed to go to predominantly white schools. And then you had that shift, right? It's the same thing with Jackie Robinson going into Major League Baseball, right? When he broke that barrier, all of a sudden now the Negro leagues didn't have the attendance they had, right? So then all of a sudden it kind of went down, right? And so it's the same thing that happened to HBCUs with football and basketball as well. When the doors opened up at white institutions, that now they realized that actually black people were smart, that they could actually do the same exact work as their white counterparts, they were allowed into the schools, and then that literally depleted the HBCUs to now they're in a situation where they're now FCS schools. And so the idea, I mean, that's really the important part, right? Is understanding, I mean, again, Notre Dame could have went out and played VMI. They could have went out and played, like I said, Mercer before, but they chose to kind of do this on a national stage and make that statement. And so then you have people saying, oh, well, why are they doing this? It's a straight schedule thing. But as you brought up in the first podcast that you guys had, is there really a big difference between Akron and Tennessee State? I don't know. Probably not. And if they go undefeated, I'm sure the fact that they played Tennessee State is not going to make a difference if the voters are going to vote them in the Final Four.
I completely agree. Unless Alabama, USC, Texas, whatever the four schools are, unless they all go undefeated, and then and you have 5 undefeated schools, then maybe Notre Dame gets left out. But that's not because of Tennessee State being on the schedule.
Well, but then, Mike, when you think about it, I mean, when you look at the SEC schools, they are inherently anyway going to be ranked higher anyway because of their opponents in the conference, right? So now you're talking about we don't have a conference championship. We're playing Navy every year. I mean, you can go down the list. So it's okay if Alabama or Auburn plays Mercer, but then people give us crap because we want to go out and play an FCS school. By the way, it's an HBCU.
It's also not Notre Dame's fault that the ACC has turned into crap here recently. Clemson's down a little bit. They'll be fine. Florida State's down. Miami's down. UNC is always a hype team there. So it's not like Notre Dame, they kind of did put their foot in the door in a conference, and then that conference is a little bit down. Okay, we're going to shift gears a little bit. Chris, if we're done with the TSU discussion.
Yeah, I mean, really just wanted to kind of let folks know really the importance of this. And they addressed it a little bit at the press conference, but, having a former player of color kind of talk about how important this is. I mean, it would have been great to have this when I was a student athlete, right? But when I think back about it, like none of our administrators were people of color. They were all white dudes, and I think there were a couple of white women in our administration, right? So, but when you look at what's happened since then, you have black administrators, right? You have more women involved in collegiate athletics, which now becomes more important. And so now, and again, I don't know any of this for a fact, but when you have people of color that are assisting in the decision-making, before in the football scheduling room, no one was talking about HBCUs. But you have some people of color now, and I'm sure they're like, well, hey, what about playing an HBCU? And then all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, okay, well, we never thought about it. Sure. And it's something like that could be so easy, but when you have the lack of diversity that they had, like when I was there, then you don't have that conversation. So that's really what I want, your listeners to understand is that this is huge. This is not just any FCS team, right? I mean, this is a HBCU, and hopefully they're going to play more in the future. But it's important to kind of make this stance because you have this historic program like Notre Dame, and now they're kind of opening up the opportunities for Black institutions, for historically Black institutions, to compete against, and I think it's great.
All right, Chris, we'll move into pregame mass is back at Notre Dame, and I didn't joke with Rick Meyer about this. I didn't know that they didn't do that anymore.
Dude, I was pissed. I honestly was pissed. I was like, wait a minute. And it's so interesting because here you have a guy who went to Ohio State and Marcus Freeman, and I loved his comments. His comments were like, well, when I got there, I was kind of surprised we weren't doing the pregame mass. And then he talked about he wanted to reintroduce it because he thought it was such a great experience when he was a recruit here. The hell?
Do you have any idea when it stopped? Like, do we know?
I'm not exactly sure what year, but I mean, I'm kind of pissed at the university a little bit because they kind of allowed that to happen. It's like, I mean, it was as traditional as your gold helmet, right? Or slapping the play like a champion sign, right? I mean, the idea of, and here, I'm not even Catholic. And I think it was one of the most intense, think about this. And this is the reason why I wanted to kind of talk about this. It was the idea that you're hanging with your brothers, right? And there's something to be said before you go out to compete and compete hard on a national level. And hours before that, you're in a religious setting and you have a priest that's blessing you before you go out. By no means am I equating this to war, but it's like battle, right? It's like going into battle. And I'm 18 years old. I'm going through this for the first time. Like, I feel like I'm protected, by whatever entity that someone believes in. And I mean, Rocket is a Muslim. He was in there. I mean, the idea in some of the comments, it just kind of pissed me off because they're saying, "Oh, are they going to have to convert? Are they all going to have to be Catholic?" And then somebody said, "Oh, is it going to be optional?" And I'm like, "Well, hold on. First of all, this you have a team. There's no optional when you have a team. Everybody does the exact same thing because everybody's treated the exact same. And I don't care if it was a Lutheran service or Muslim service. The idea, or I'm sorry, Islamic service, but the idea is that you're in a room with no one but your brothers, and the guy's about to go into battle. And I mean, I remember specifically Father Reilly kind of blessing us, and then he would give us a token, and it was the kind of thing. It was a medallion that, let's say like Saint Joseph or whoever it was. And again, not a Catholic kid. I was baptized Lutheran. I mean, I'm putting it on a string around my neck for the game. Like I feel like I'm protected. And so the idea that Coach Kelly did away with that, and for whatever reason, more meeting time, too far to walk before a game. I don't know what it was, but the idea that it was, and you should see, I mean, I'm on a thread with a whole bunch of former players, and we were all stunned. And to a man, and again, they all aren't Catholic, to a man, they were just talking about like how important that was doing it before a game, not Friday night.
Chris, how is this just now getting out? Like, maybe Kelly, they were doing it for a few years and then it's fallen off, or how is this just now a thing that we're learning though? Like it's
Well,
crazy.
well, it's kind of the same thing. And this, again, I'm surprised and kind of embarrassed a little bit. But since Brian Kelly has left, all these stories are coming up. Well, he wasn't this. He wasn't a team guy. He wasn't a good recruiter. I mean, if all these things were going on, so let's say he didn't leave. All these things are going on. Like people knew about it, but no one said anything. And I guess that's the hard part, is that really kind of no one at the university, no one outside who knew this stuff that was going on, actually kind of stood up to him or went to the university and said, hey, these things are important, right? I mean, so one of the things I think is hilarious that changed under Coach Kelly were these crazy helmets, right? I mean, I don't even know what color they are. They're almost like glitter helmets, right? I mean, I think they're hilarious. Like, they don't paint the helmets the way they did back in the day anymore. And it's crazy because they send them off to get reconditioned. The hell? I mean, I remember it was so, and this is way before you were born, I'm sure, but the night before a game, I mean, people that's when they would paint the helmets, right, with actual gold. People would bring like shoes by, they'd bring hats by to have the managers like kind of just throw some of the gold paint on the shoe, on their own personal shoes or their own hat, which I thought was great. But it's these traditions that when you get older, you realize how important they are, that we're going by the wayside because of convenience. And I guess the only response I could say is, well, we won a national championship and we had to do mass at like St. Ed's and walk, a quarter of a mile over to the stadium. I mean, it's okay. And so the idea that there were a handful of things, or there were a lot of things that folks talked about with Brian Kelly that we didn't find out until he left, which I think is so surprising.
Chris, we don't know for sure if Marcus Freeman can coach a lick as a head coach. We really don't know. We saw the Fiesta Bowl, but other than that, we don't know. But as a Notre Dame alum, former football player, you have to be really excited about the direction of the program. Again, we don't know if he can coach, but I feel like what he's doing off the field, which kind of leads into the next point we want to talk about, alumni inclusion. That's something we're learning more and more about that Brian Kelly did not do. This is the inaugural Notre Dame Legacy football weekend coming up for the spring game. Keyword inaugural. This is the first one. This is not something that Brian Kelly did. So are you kind of in the same line of thinking? Like, I think Marcus Freeman is going to be a really good head coach for Notre Dame, but obviously jury's still going to be out on that. But what he's doing, pregame mass, alumni inclusion, scheduling at HBCU school, you kind of like where the direction's going here? You pretty fired up about Freeman?
I do have to say, I had him on my podcast a couple times. I was sold then when he was a defensive coordinator. It's hilarious because I tell all my former teammates, I sent him the link to my podcast because we're talking and he made a statement and said, Chris, I'm not going, and this is when he was the defensive coordinator, linebackers coach. He said, Chris, I'm not going after Notre Dame men. And I was like, whoa, hold on, whoa, you can't say that. That's sacrilege. What are you talking about? He's like, Chris, I want to go after the best players possible. And I was like, well, yeah. He's like, no, Chris, you understand. I want to go, let's bring them in, sell them on Notre Dame, and see if they want to be here or not. And I thought that was so interesting because no longer, or at least at the time when he was recruiting, he wasn't just looking at kids at Catholic schools who are valedictorians, right? Which that's what Notre Dame recruited all the time, right? And it's so interesting because he talked about a young man and he recruited him. He said he was going to attend Notre Dame. And Coach Kelly went to Marcus Freeman and said, Marcus, we wouldn't normally have gone after him. The fact that we got him is great. And he told that story, and I was flabbergasted. Like, I mean, for him to admit that, hey, this is a typical kid that we don't go after, but we went after him, and he wants to be here. That's great. And kind of like, I mean, my mouth was, open. I mean, my jaw dropped because I was like, what are you kidding me?
I have to opine every time I hear that kind of story, to me, I don't know how closely you follow recruiting, Chris. Jalen Sneed comes to mind.
Okay.
I don't know if that's who he has in mind, or when he's saying that, but a linebacker from South Carolina who had all the SEC offers from a public high school. Now, the thing about Sneed was that, Freeman and his head coach were friends for 20 years, so that obviously helped, but they definitely have gone into areas and recruited kids that they would not usually maybe recruit or have a shot with.
Here's another thing, Mike, and I think this was funny because my first interview with him was around the same time that it was the week after. Well, it was the week after Oklahoma had their barbecue day where they brought all those like Bentleys and Lamborghinis, and I joked with Marcus. I was like, hey, yeah, isn't it terrible that Oklahoma has to do that? He was like, Chris, I want Notre Dame to do that. And I was like, what are you talking about? What? He's like, Chris, whatever we need to do to bring them to campus. And then we can talk about, and dude, I'm about to repeat exactly what he said. It's like a broken record. But he said, Chris, you want to compete against national championships? We do that. You want a chance to go to the NFL? At that time, we had the most players drafted by any school. The third thing that we can offer you that no one else can, and dude, I'm repeating exactly what he said, that no one else can offer you is a world-class education. So cool, you want to say Clemson, you want to say Alabama, first two, I got you. But you can't tell me that a degree from Notre Dame is the equivalent to a degree from Alabama or a degree from Clemson. I'm sorry, it's not. That's what I can offer you. Dude, and I was like, man, look, I'm 52. Sign me up. I was 52 at the time. Sign me up. I'm ready to play for you. So I say all that to say that I'm sold on him. I was sold on him as a defensive coordinator. Now you talk about him. It's so interesting, Mike. And I hate that. I don't want to bore you with all my Marcus Freeman stories, but it's so interesting because I was hosting my Super 16 poll show, which we covered the top 16 teams each week. And we were on live, and my producer was like, Chris, Brian Kelly just left. And I was like, get out of here. He showed me, look, ESPN just saw, I was like, oh my God. He's like, Chris, real quick, who do you think should be the head coach? Of course, Marcus Freeman wasn't even in my top 5. I mean, I was talking about Andy Heck. I was talking about Luke Fickell. I mean, I was talking about a whole bunch of other people. And he said, well, Christian, what about Marcus Freeman? I was like, there's no way. Never been a head coach before. He's been on campus for 11 months. There's no way it's going to happen. And, of course, it happens. And I'm being honest. I mean, I didn't think ever that would happen. But then you think about the groundswell that happened with recruits, happened with former players, with the current players. It was a situation, wow, we really need to look at this guy because he's amazing. Look, I met him once. I see him from afar, right? I don't know him that well. I don't know him personally. But the idea that I felt so compelled as a old guy thinking, hey, man, I want to go out there and play again for this guy. I was already so I can't imagine what happens to a 15, 16-year-old kid when he has a conversation with Marcus Freeman.
It's a long way to say yes, Chris. I'm just teasing you.
I am straight up. And that's not even talking about the outreach that he's done. I mean.
Yeah, touch on that. Oh, yeah, touch on that.
So I was fortunate enough to have another interview with him. And I'm going to release that next week. Or no, actually the week before the spring game.
Okay.
He talks about how he went to go visit Coach Holtz. What?
Breaking news.
The idea that you're going to go and kind of seek knowledge from someone who's done it before. So we talked about that. We talked about how getting someone like Al Golden on the staff, because he has head coaching experience. This is Marcus saying this. And I stopped. I was like, okay, first of all, stop. Now, understand that this is a current head coach at Notre Dame saying, hey, I don't know everything about being a head coach. Let me go find someone that has been a head coach before at 2 institutions. I mean, that's what leadership is. When you don't know what's going on, find somebody who does.
That's a low ego thing. That Marcus Freeman says, I don't have all the answers. Chris, we're men. We think we know everything.
Absolutely.
And he said, I don't know everything.
About Coach Freeman is that he's willing to say, hey, I don't know. And by going to talk to someone like Coach Holtz, find out, hey, how did you do it? You know, how did you have the performance, the academic pressures, recruiting, everything else? Willing to kind of say, hey, I don't know, let me learn from you. I think that says volumes about the man, right? And then when we had the conversation about Al Golden, you know, I was stunned because you have to juxtapose Coach Freeman with Brian Kelly, who you couldn't tell him anything.
Man.
And oh, by the way, he goes and hires a guy who's been a head coach at 2 places to say, hey, you know what? Help me be the head coach. Help me be a great head coach. Help me with the success of this team. That's leadership. How could you not want to follow that guy? And so now you talk about former players, right? So now you talk about, and this is kind of, I mean, I hate to bring this up, and this is just so kind of heartbreaking, but he was on my podcast, and when he was named the head coach, I had a bunch of former players kind of chime in, so we did a couple shows talking about it, and we started to talk about how Coach Freeman had already been, this is before he became the head coach, he was already talking to former players. And so at the time, we're like, hey, that's great. He's the head coach now. Hopefully, we'll be welcome back. Because at the time, unless you, and this was so weird because I worked there under Coach Weiss. And if you weren't a former NFL player, he wouldn't even acknowledge you. He wouldn't even, and there were times when guys couldn't even go to practice, former players. So you have him as the head coach who only wants pros around his players. And then you have Brian Kelly, who was more about the Brian Kelly era, who didn't welcome folks back. The only guys he welcomed back were guys who played under him.
Right.
So you have people like, I had Tim Brown, Rocket Ishmael, we had Joe Theismann. The conversation I'm talking about was Ross Browner. And he talked about this on the podcast, and I was just heartbroken. So this is a couple months before he passed away, actually. And he talked about a story about how they were there for, you know, I'm sure it was the 77 squad or whatever. And he wanted to talk to some of the players. So he went over to kind of talk to them, and the security guards were like, no, you can't talk to them. Dude, he told a story. I mean, I got the chills now. I mean, Ross Browner is probably the most decorated player that Notre Dame has ever had, award-wise. I mean, maybe even higher than Manti Te'o, right? I mean, higher than Heisman Trophy winners. He was 5th in the Heisman Trophy. He won the Maxwell Award. This dude was an absolute stud. And you're telling him he can't interact with the players? Dude, I was heartbroken, right, when he told that story. And I relayed that to Coach Freeman and said, you know, I hope things like this. And he was like, Chris, that will never happen under my regime. And then that's when we talked about doing this legacy network and really kind of emphasizing the importance of it. Now, I will have to say, and you can talk to Hunter Bivin, who's in charge of it, it started under Brian Kelly, but it was just trying to kind of keep track of former players. There was never, hey, come back, you're welcome, which we're seeing for the spring game.
Chris, it seems like it was more of let's keep track of former players so we can use their success to pitch to recruits and not so much have them back on campus, right?
That's 100% exactly what you're talking about. And it's frustrating. And I'm not trying to throw Hunter under the bus. He's doing a phenomenal job now. But, you know, he played for Kelly. And so, you know, his directive, he can only do what he's supposed to do, what his boss tells him to do. But now there's this tremendous outpouring of former players, and Rick Meyer talked about it when you interviewed him. The idea that we have monthly Zoom calls with the coaches, and it's just former players.
Really?
Yes. Well, that's what he alluded to. They're called the state of the program addresses.
And okay, so I've heard about. Okay, yeah.
So the first one was with Coach Freeman. It was Coach Freeman, all former players, and then it was Tommy Rees, all former players, and I think the next one is either going to be Al Golden or Coach Washington.
Yep.
But every month we have a chance as former players to interact with the coaching staff. The hell? That's amazing.
What's the benefit for them to do this?
Well, I think a lot of it's not necessarily for the individual coaches. I think it's more for us saying, hey, we're now welcome, right? And oh, by the way, some of the guys are high school coaches. Some of the guys have kids who are great players. Great story. I had Irv Smith on my podcast. Irv Smith talked about how he reached out to Notre Dame and said, hey, my son, look, I brainwashed him. He wants to go to Notre Dame. Can you please just take a look at him? Nothing.
And now, Emmett Mosley's kid. How about that? 2024, they're after him now. I mean, yeah.
Well, the idea, and oh, by the way, Irv Smith's kid went to Alabama, competed for 2 national championships, started for 2 years, got drafted into the NFL. So, oh, by the way, shame on Notre Dame, right? But that's the idea, to make sure that we as former players feel welcome. And how do you do that, right? You do that by exposing the staff to the former players. Now, I can guarantee, you talk about 100, 200 plus people on these Zoom calls. Mike, you understand, that's never happened. That didn't happen under Coach Holtz, let alone, what Coach Freeman has done.
Man, talking Tennessee State, game day mass, alumni inclusion, man, I'm excited. Chris, we will definitely have you on. We went just a tad bit longer than we were planning.
Sorry about that. You got me fired up. And I was talking about Notre Dame football, which I'm passionate about. But I think, again, when you talk about this historic moment, and I guarantee you, Mike, I'm 1,000%, I guarantee you this, more Power 5 schools are going to be reaching out to HBCUs now and literally kind of spreading that wealth, right? Because $1 million to Akron is great, but $1 million to TCU is even greater because they don't get that type of opportunity very often. And again, if you're going to be playing Mercer or VMI, why not spread the wealth to other institutions as well?
All right. You guys have heard it from Chris Zorich. Chris, appreciate all the time, man. That we'll definitely have you on again.
Absolutely, man. Look forward to it, Mike. Thanks a lot.